You're just in time for a shortage of everything. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, there was a headline in the New York Times that caught my attention that says, "How the world ran out of everything." And because I work in a retail environment, I understand that better than many people do because I get paid straight commission when stuff gets delivered, and it's hard getting stuff delivered these days. And so the thrust of the story was about an idea that may seem unimportant to most people in their daily lives, but has actually been crucial to the way of life that you've enjoyed for the past several decades. And that is just-in-time inventory management. It used to be in the old days that a company would stockpile the parts that it needed to make whatever widgets it was making. And so when it was time to run that assembly line, they had everything on hand. They realized, though, over time that that was a great cost to the organization. But if they could get those parts delivered just before they needed to have them on the assembly line, they could save a lot of money because they wouldn't be stockpiling inventory, which costs the company money to keep on its books. And as a result of just-in-time inventory, logistical processes were able to flow more smoothly. More money was made by companies. That was passed on to shareholders. Your 401k probably benefited as a result of just-in-time inventory. But during the pandemic of 2020/21, all of a sudden, those global supply chains started to break down for a wide variety of reasons. And the just-in-time delivery system was probably, as much as anything, part of that recipe for disaster that made a scarcity of everything that we now see. Stephen Green, are we seeing kind of on a societal level the tendency of individuals to avoid preparing for the future? And the reason I ask that is this. In this story, there's a quote that says, "Consumers won't pay for resilience when they are not in crisis." In other words, we love these cheap systems that make it possible to have cheap goods when we want them. And when the crisis passes, we're not willing to say, you know what, we don't want this to happen again. So let's pay a little more. Is there a kind of, Steve, a childlike faith in the resilience of our economic systems?
Childlike is right. One of the biggest aspects of becoming an adult is the ability, at least one would hope you develop the ability, to look into the future and assess your risks and act accordingly. And paying a higher price for supply chains that are more robust is, it's like buying insurance for your house or your car. It's just good sense to do that. I mean, even if car insurance weren't mandatory, it would still be a really good idea to insure your car, because it's one thing to have to buy a car, which is a major purchase, but then to have to buy another one while you're still making payments on the first one that you just wrecked would be insane. And that's essentially what paying more for a quality good is. To give you an example of how it's playing out in the real world, I'm going to give you a total first world problem. When we put in our wet bar a few years ago, of course we put in the standalone under the counter ice maker. It produces those beautiful crystal clear ice cubes that aren't cloudy at all. And you know how I love my cocktails. Good ice is very important to me. It became an essential part of my life in a very short time. The ice maker, the drain pump, died last week, actually 2 weeks ago now. It took a week just to get a plumber in because everybody has been doing, an appliance guy in because everybody's been doing all these home renovations, and all the appliance guys, all the plumbers, everybody is booked up. He finally gets in, and it wasn't to repair the thing. It was to look at it and tell me, yes, the pump is broken. Knew that. And then to go back to the manufacturer and order a new pump, which normally he tells me takes 7 to 10 business days to take care of, which is okay, fine. But these days, he says, it takes up to 2 months to get just a simple mechanical pump replaced because the manufacturer is that strained from all the very things we were talking about. And now I'm stuck putting freezer ice, regular old freezer ice, in my cocktails like an Amish person. It's absolute hell here. I can't even begin to tell you. It used to be if you needed lumber to build your house or to put your floors in your house, you went to your neighbor who had the saw and he cut down the tree and got you some lumber and you were good. The problem is that was very slow and it was very expensive. Now the lumber comes from all over the world. You don't nowhere. You don't have any idea. And when one little link in the chain goes bad, and it's always the weakest link, then suddenly there's no lumber. And as a result, prices are up 450% in recent months. Somewhere between your neighbor with the saw and the global supply chain is what makes sense. And we've gone way too far in one direction. But if consumers aren't going to pay, what are you going to do?
By the way, new members at BillWhittle.com this week will receive a printed copy of Stephen Green's Cavalcade of Amish Cocktails. So make sure you sign up
Free
for that.
With your membership, that's right.
At BillWhittle.com. Bill, the whole just-in-time inventory system relies on a couple of things. Being able to have lean inventories means you need to have reliable, low-cost shipping, because you've got to be able to predict when something's going to get there, and you've got to be able to nail down that price well in advance so that you can control the cost of the goods that you're manufacturing. I had read a story recently that said the cost of a container ship crossing the Pacific in the past year has gone from about $1,500 to about $6,000. And that's if you can get one. If you've seen the aerial photos, the satellite pictures of the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, you see that what used to be a steady flow of ships coming in and ships going out is now a steady flow of ships coming in, ships going out, and ships that are just sitting around on the lawn like some impressionistic piece of art where they're just lounging around there in the bay waiting to get into the dock. It's interesting, this idea of consumers not being willing to pay for resilience, and you wonder, what is the compromise between, as a society, us behaving like we're a bunch of doomsday preppers where we've got to have backup inventory of everything, and just completely irresponsible failure to take precautions? How do we balance that?
Well, before I get to that, let me just say that during the yellow fever epidemics that struck this country during the worst one, there were there were bodies just stacked outside doors like cordwood. People would go into houses months later and find entire families of 12 or 15 people just simply died in place. And I know that, you've got to have some pretty amazing and horrific stories to tell. For me, when I get to my sunset years and I look back on the horrors of the COVID-19 crisis, I'll tell whoever will listen to me that I actually heard a story of a man who had to go with cloudy ice cubes for a number of weeks before the cocktails were back. At least they didn't shut down Steve's vodka pipeline. That would have been catastrophic.
Oh, you can't just shut that down.
There are
lives, jobs, everything else depending on it. It'd be like shutting down Alaska
and
oil
multiple
pipeline.
pathways.
Pay the ransom to the hackers, Steve. Pay the ransom.
We don't do anything about our electrical infrastructure, which is more important and in far greater danger than our international supply network. So if you're asking me, are we going to build resiliency into this, the answer is, in my opinion, no. And that's because we are now a nation of grasshoppers. And for those of you not familiar with the story of the grasshopper and the ant, on account of it being written before you were born, the parable goes that the ants work hard to save enough food for the winter, while the grasshopper simply goes around and plays his fiddle. Winter comes, the grasshopper's got nothing to eat. He goes to the ants and asks the ants to feed him, and turns out they do, don't they? I don't remember whether they do or not. They should have kicked the bastard out on his butt.
They should have eaten him.
Should have eaten him. It's human nature to believe that since we got away with something today, we'll get away with it tomorrow. This is how you can explain the Challenger disaster, Columbia disaster, Apollo 1 fire. You can explain the Titanic, all of this stuff. All of these catastrophes had known precedents and didn't happen yesterday and probably not going to happen today. And that is simply human nature. One of the things that you're talking about, the cost of the lower cost in terms of inventory of this kind of on-demand manufacturing. It's not just the inventory cost. It's also insurance against obsolescence. To give you an example, We did this exactly wrong 5, 6, 7 years ago, and we spent a lot of money and bought a whole lot of BillWhittle.com T-shirts, most of which sold, but many of which are still on the shelf back there. And that's just inventory that we carried. It's not that T-shirts are obsolete, but that design's probably sold about as many as it's going to. And what we should have done is we should have done the way I did my book. I could have bought a ton of Silent America books, sat on them, put out a huge amount of money, which I didn't have, and hoped to sell them all. Or I could basically have them print them as they're needed. Now, I don't get to keep as much of that profit, but I'm not carrying this huge inventory load that becomes obsolete when the product doesn't sell anymore. I guess that's what I'm saying. So if you've got an entire stockpile of either, burnt orange or avocado green, kitchen utensils back from the 70s, you're probably sitting on a bunch of money that you're not going to get back. All of these advantages, I think, outweigh the potential for another disaster, which may or may not happen. So I suspect that if we see this again, we're going to find ourselves in the exact same situation. We as a species always assume that money in hand is here now, and saving money in the future is morning guy's problem.
There is a charming sense of ruthless optimism in the species, is there not? Where people basically say,
ruthless stupidity too.
The thing that just happened to me is unlikely to happen again. It's why we youngsters would, laugh into our hands about our parents and grandparents, especially if you had ancestors who grew up during the Great Depression, and their quaint ways of, my grandmother was still canning vegetables in the 1970s. And it was like, it just seemed to be a huge hassle to us. And it didn't really...
Your grandchildren may be too, Scotty, if we're going down this road.
She made her own jelly and preserves.
It didn't... we did that too, yeah. We had cherry trees, and we had grape arbors and peach trees and apple trees, and we had all this stuff in our backyard. We had like an unbelievable number of fruits and vegetables in our backyard. But it seemed at the time to us as kids to be this huge hassle where you're, putting green beans in jars that you're going to eat in January or whatever. But it was a kind of ethos that was deep in my grandmother's spirit because she had seen what it's like when January comes and there are no green beans and there's no place that you can get green beans. She knew what it was like to live through that. And even though she didn't consciously express that and say, well, we need to can these beans now because we may be starving to death in February, that's kind of the inner drive that made that happen. I'm torn on this whole issue because I know that this whole time inventory has been a real revolution and frankly saved companies that would have otherwise gone under because not only could they not carry enough inventory, just the cost of doing that, but as Bill talked about, the idea of maybe having a bunch of inventory that's gone obsolete. I myself did what Bill did when I published books in the past of my own writings. And I just thought, I don't want to have a big pallet of books out of my driveway. So I contacted what's called an ODP, an on-demand printer. And I literally had him print one book. I looked at it and I go, well, that looks nice. And then a couple weeks later, I sent him an email and said, hey, can you mail 25 of those to the Amazon Distribution Center in Tennessee? And then a couple weeks after that, could you mail 700 of those to the Amazon Distribution Center? And they just made them as they needed them. And they sent them to Amazon and I never touched them. It was a beautiful thing. And I do have kind of a childlike, hopeful faith in the future of our ability to handle these economic setbacks. I sometimes remind my customers in the retail environment when they are, especially the younger ones who just seem shocked, like, how can this be that my sofa is not going to be here for you don't know when my sofa is going to be here? How is that possible? And I'd say, well, that's just kind of the way it is right now. And they're like, well, this is terrible. And I say, yeah, it's bad. But I was raised by my grandparents who grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. This is inconvenient. The Great Depression was not the word inconvenient was not used during the Great Depression. I will tell you how bad this is with me. In Texas, where I live, we had a crisis a few months ago where we had a deep freeze, and because of a variety of issues related to unpreparedness and mismanagement and just stuff that happens to human machines, all of a sudden a lot of people were without power for 2, 3, 4 days. It was freezing cold. We were taking wood and bottled water and food and stuff like that to one of our neighbors, and they were trying to keep their pipes from freezing, and a lot of people's pipes broke and destroyed their floors and their furniture and stuff like that. All of that happened, and I thought, you know what? It would be a really good idea to have like a gasoline-powered generator that we could just have there if this ever happens again, because, it didn't hit us this time, but if it hits us, me personally, I want to be ready for that. And I will just end this episode of Right Angle by saying this. I do not own a generator. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.
Me neither.